Welcome to tonight's session on bias. We're delighted that you could be joining us. Tonight we have Freddie Jesus with us, and Freddie has
Hello.
done, I'm sorry.
Hello.
Hi, Freddie. Freddie has worked with us to develop the session for this evening, and we're very pleased to have her on. She's a certified facilitator for socialstudies.com. And Freddie, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us, everyone.
Yes, hello everyone. Welcome. Good evening. My name is Freddie Jesus. I've been teaching for about 25 years. I'm from Austin, Texas. I'm excited to speak with you tonight about teaching students how to just look and analyze primary sources with looking at it from different points of view, and how to take away different lenses that you might come to the viewing with it. So let's go ahead and get started. And the primary sources, we want to look at the audience it was intended for and what its purpose was. What I'd like to do is, this makes me think of Atticus Finch from the book To Kill a Mockingbird with Scout's father, Atticus Finch. And let's look at this quote. Well, I'm having some difficulty. Let me see if I can. There it is. Atticus Finch famously said, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." And that's what we want our students to do. When they have an issue or a problem, a reading they need to analyze, we want them to look at it and draw conclusions about what the author's meaning or purpose or intent is. So how can we approach this? We're going to look at a couple of topics, and when exploring a new topic, I want my students to think about their background knowledge they bring to it, what point of view they have, and what tone that might be there underlying. What do you already know? You might already have impressions that you may have read or heard about already. And sometimes what you know is accurate, but sometimes it's not, and you want to keep an open mind as you learn about different topics. Tonight we're going to look at two topics where there is bias and varying points of view. But first, let's look at what exactly is bias. What is the definition for bias? Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered to be unfair. We want our students to read through articles, analyze photos, but how do we proceed knowing that we already have bias, but still move forward and be open to looking at it from these different vantage points? I love this example on our next slide of 6 and 9. And these two people both are looking at this numeral, and depending which man you are, the numeral is either 6 or 9. Both are correct. So let's look at a more complex topic. On the next slide, that takes us to the 1960s and 1970s. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and you see a picture of Rachel right there, Miss Carson. And this book was written in 1962, and President Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. So that's kind of the era we're looking at. Now, Within her writing, Rachel Carson presented a lot of scientific facts, but she was really a citizen. And these facts were not new, but the way she was able to present them and these facts from an ecological perspective, she made the science content very interesting and understandable to the average person. So if I was looking at this and I would ask questions and pose questions to my students, I would have them look at the cover, Silent Spring. What do you see? You probably see a river and a spring and vegetation around it. Look at the title, Silent Spring, so that implies sound. There must be sounds from creatures, fish, or insects. But what would happen if all of the living things were gone? What would happen without those living creatures and plants? No pollination, death. So Eliza Griswold wrote an article in the New York Times in 2012 where she spoke about Silent Spring, and it presented a view of nature compromised by synthetic pesticides, especially DDT. And once these pesticides entered the biosphere, they not only killed bugs, but they also made their way up the food chain and threatened fish, birds, populations, eventually making people ill, especially children, and that was kind of the hot topic at the time. Much of the data and the case studies that Rachel Carson drew from were not new. The scientific community had known about these findings for some time, but Carson was the first one to really put them together for the general public and draw conclusions with those. And she really spawned a revolution from that. Now, as a young woman, I remember seeing and reading this book, and I was outraged. How could we do this? My thoughts were racing. What about our environment? Are we stewards of the earth? What could be done? I came across an article during this time in the National Geographic, and it was about the use of the pesticides DDT. Could there be another point of view? So there was an article about the use of these DDT on nets where people in Africa were struggling with malaria, and when they dipped the nets in the pesticide of DDT, the pesticide obviously killed the mosquitoes off, and the death toll for malaria really dropped off. It was just astounding. And in National Geographic, they had charts and graphs about nets without DDT and nets with the DDT, the pesticide, and I was really fascinated by that because I had never thought, it had never occurred to me that there was a place where the pesticide would actually be needed. So I want to kind of go back to what would I do with this with students. And I would show these pictures, and you see two pictures here. What do you see? Someone's wearing gloves and holding a bottle, and then you see nets over a sleeping area in a rural setting. I might pose, are these safe? Well, the gloves imply that it's not. So this really changed how I viewed the world and how I viewed things in my life. And from that point on, really, I challenged myself to look at things not just from a single point of view, but many points of view. Let's look at another slide with a new topic, and this one has a historical connection. The journey of immigration, it tells a story, and it's what makes up America. There have been many waves of people who have come to America to create a new life for themselves. It's a tough, heart-wrenching decision to leave everything behind and depart on an unknowable future in America. Many hope to improve their lives. Others leave in fear to escape hardship, economic, political hardship conditions at home. Now, the first wave of immigration to come to Ellis Island was from Europe, and mainly they came from Northern and Western Europe. And this was Ireland. These are countries that were Ireland, Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. The second wave, or the new immigration, occurred in the 1880s. The new wave came because of overpopulation, rural areas that were impoverished, political oppression in Russia, among other reasons. People immigrated from Poland, Italy, Hungary, Greece, and they came to America, an industrialized America that was hungry for workers. America needed people for mines, railroads, factories, farms, and shops. So you can see on the screen, you have Europe with, it's crowded, it's blue and white. Maybe people are not getting their needs met for whatever reason. And so it's an opportunity to come to America where they can be more, make their life better. So what might be reasons people would come to America? There might be many reasons they choose to improve their life, to escape these economic and political hardship conditions, especially at home. And they have to make the decision, is it worth it to make that journey? They're in a ship, in the bottom of a ship many times, in the steerage compartment. Not a lot of space, all of their worldly goods with them, and it's dangerous and unhealthy. So let's take a little bit of time and look at our first primary source. And this is an article about immigrants arriving at Ellis Island from the New York Times in 1893. The immigrant is a patient, stolid animal as he appears at the handling station, with bags and bundles and cheap grip sacks packed in the continental Europe and half dazed with the new experience. This horde of human beings found themselves, the instant they set foot beneath the stars and stripes, prisoners, as effectively as if they had met at a prison station in Russia, bound for Siberia. They might walk in but one path from the gangplank, the one leading to the easterly end of the long, low building. In this, they might enter but a single room. This room was bound by an iron fence, and once within, the immigrant on a search for the land of freedom became deprived of all personal liberty for the moment. So I would ask my students, if I was looking at this, to look at the words. Okay? Does the author want you to like the immigrant? Probably not. What does the author want you to think about the immigrant? He's been on a tiresome path, crowded on a ship, being sent somewhere remote like Siberia. So they're kind of comparing it to a prison. What is a handling station? Here they mean Ellis Island. And why, another question I might pose is, why might a major New York newspaper have been especially interested in immigrants and their treatment at Ellis Island in 1893? At that time, Ellis Island was in New York's harbor, and it had just opened. The view of immigrants in this article, I would ask my students, what does it mean to convey when it describes the immigrant as patient and a patient-stolid animal, or as half-crazed, or part of a horde of human beings? Some may see these as demeaning expressions. Others might take it to be more of a criticism of a confusing situation the immigrants faced at Ellis Island. I would wonder if this was a luxurious trip for the immigrants. Was it better than where they had come from? Remember, they were in the steerage compartment or the lower area of a ship, sometimes for 2 or 3 months. They had no clean food or water, and their belongings were just like jostled around with the turns of the ship. And through all of that, they had to weather many cold storms. So let's take a little bit, let's look at another primary source. And this one is a picture. Here you see an inspector, U.S. inspectors, examining the eyes of immigrants shortly after their arrival at Ellis Island in New York in 1913. So from this perspective, I would ask my students to look at the clothing of the people, to look at how the inspector is dressed, look at the surroundings. Were they able to walk freely? No, it was closed in. You see a lot of chain link type fencing. It was cold. Everyone has coats and jackets and baggage with them. You can see they also focus, there's a focus on, it's very impersonal. And sometimes there was a focus on the inspectors or the officials being corrupt, but they tried to be protective of the immigrants from that. Many immigrants would move through the different stages, and they might make it through all of the checkpoints of Ellis Island, or they would decide to go back. The aspect of the Ellis Island system was meant to tell the immigrants America is superior, while defining their own culture as lacking in comparison, because they're coming to America, so America wants them to join this country and be American. Questions I might look at with my students would be, is it worth it for the immigrants, all of the conditions they endured? How do you think they felt at this point of their journey? Many of them, looking at the picture, they're not laughing. Their faces are concerned, tired, maybe confused, under duress, scared. So let's look at a bigger picture of what the checkpoints might look like at Ellis Island. And here you see a broader look. Immigrants received from Ellis Island traveled through, and you can see it's not an open area. It's an organized bureaucracy, and they're channeled from checkpoint to checkpoint to checkpoint because they had to process many, many people on a daily basis. Sometimes they would have 5,000 immigrants in one day go through a checkpoint. You also have to remember that during this time, these people are coming and they speak very different languages, and they don't all speak the same language. So the inspectors also had to understand many languages, and there was always openings for inspectors who were multilingual, because that was a need they had. I like just looking at the detail. Here you see it's not very friendly. It's lots of processing, walking up and down certain aisles, fencing, things like that. It's not a very friendly place or welcoming place. All right, let's look at another point of view, and we've looked at some negative points of view. Let's look at our third primary source. And this one is taken from a French woman, and she was noted in the New York Times in 1924. The ladies and gentlemen in charge of immigrants have inexhaustible patience and kindness. The large admission hall in the evening is used as concert room once a week and as a cinema once also. Sundays, a Catholic, a Protestant, and Jewish service are held so that any creed can be followed. All this is free. There are 2 hospitals, a kindergarten, medical attendants, all free, as well as board, lodging, and entertainment. So this Ellis Island in this way is almost a romantic way, and it's seen as a welcoming doorway to a new and better life for immigrants. This is how the immigrants saw themselves. This is how they saw it. They came to Ellis Island, and especially the ones who had very little incident. They went through the checkpoints and came to America, and it was a new beginning. America welcomed the immigrants, showed respect for them, and made real efforts to protect them from any mistreatment. So, in looking at this, it seemed like there was a lot to offer the different immigrants who came through. So I would ask questions of my students. In 1921 and 1924, there were new strict immigration laws passed. They established quotas for each country with strict limited amounts allowed from Eastern and Southern Europe. So remember, the Eastern and Southern Europe, they were less educated, and they were from Italy and Greece. And this was the new immigration, that was the name that was given. This drastically reduced the number passing through Ellis Island. And as a French woman, the quota system would have been friendlier to her than it would have been from the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Many of these people would have been excluded or regarded as unwelcome. I might also ask, what aspects of the experience did the French woman leave out? So she talked about healthcare, the cleanliness, the food, respect for religious preferences, the entertainment, but she did not comment on those that were sent back, or the procedures, the bureaucracy of the inspections for the people themselves. So let's take a minute. Now, when exactly did Ellis Island open? Let's take a minute and think about that. Ellis Island opened its doors to immigrants in 1892, and here it's shown in 1913. We want our students to analyze parts of a historical event or era with the lens to see how people in the past thought and felt. What were the primary and secondary challenges of the time? What was their thought process? And how can we empathize with the culture or subgroups, looking at them and their differences, commonalities, and drawing conclusions about what was best for them? In looking at this, no perspective is really right. It's really about understanding the struggle and what happened during that time and learning from it. This was a hard journey for these people, and they showed courage and bravery, and they wanted to improve their circumstance. So America in the early 1900s wanted immigrants to come, and they were okay with unskilled labor. They needed it because of the industrialized era America had to offer. They needed the unskilled workers, and they also wanted to offer an introduction to a new life and society, but it still had many layers. Now, finally, in looking at this, we've looked at a couple of different topics. And whenever I'm teaching about a topic with my students, I always go back and try to relate it back to their real own world. Even if it's a hypothetical question, want to keep them thinking about life and how we engage in it. I'll ask them questions like, are we open to welcoming people who immigrate to our country today? Or I might ask them, how do we want to treat these new members of our community? What lessons did we learn? Are we smarter? What lessons did we learn from Ellis Island? And it certainly really changes their perspective for sure. In conclusion, I love this picture of this elephant and all of these people around him. You can see, depending on which point of view, some think it's a spear or a fan or a wall or a rope. It's a tree or a snake. So in conclusion, where could I use this, or how could I use it in my teaching? I could use any bias and looking at different points of view, really in any of the sciences, any kind of topic where I'm testing a theory or a hypothesis. In English and with reading novels. In reading novels, I could look at comprehension and understanding different themes. I could look at the positive and the negative outcomes and analyzing the characters. In writing specifically, I could use it with compare and contrast, persuasive, an editorial essay, nonfiction research, any kind of debate setting. And then finally in history, especially the 1890s and through the 1910s, the industrialized era of America, that need for unskilled labor, social and economic structures, that would work. I'd like to give credit for information about Ellis Island. It was taken from a historian's apprentice at Social Studies School Service, Nystrom, and so it's certainly an exciting topic to look at, and one with lots of different points of view to look at. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of this today.
Thank you, Freddie. That was fabulous. I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I did.